Hello everyone, Dehancer team here. Today we will talk you through colour and show you how your eyes may be deceiving you. This is the introductory part of our 3-hour-long lecture, How to See Colour. Before defining colour, I'd like to quote Richard Langton Gregory, author of Eye and Brain, The Psychology of Seeing. Before life came, all was silent, though the mountains toppled. Imagine an earthquake in the mountains. The earth is shaking, huge boulders are flying, stones are hitting against each other, but there is complete silence, and only when a living creature appears in this place, sound arises. Because sound is a sensation in the head of a person or, for example, an animal, which arises when they are exposed to the waves of mechanical vibrations. As long as there is no living creature, there is no concept of sound. The situation is similar with colour. Until there is a living creature, the concept of colour does not exist, although there are natural phenomena that are capable of generating this sensation. So, here is the definition of colour. Colour is a sensation that arises in a person's head under the influence of electromagnetic radiation, with a wavelength of the so-called visible spectrum on his visual system. It is important to understand that these sensations can arise for other reasons. Moreover, one is able to experience colour sensations with one's eyes completely closed. For example, in a dream, with hallucinations, due to painful sensations, mental associations, etc. That is, the connection between what we see and how we perceive it is rather fragile. Of course, there is that connection, but not at all as unambiguous and reliable as it is commonly believed. Let me show you how your eyes can deceive you. Let's start with a simple geometric test. At what angle to the horizontal line are these blue stripes drawn? To you it seems that under different angles, like a zigzag, but not really. All stripes are strictly parallel. In order to check that, just add more horizontal lines to the drawing. Another geometric test. How many black dots do you see? At the same time, no more than 4, in rare cases 6. In fact, there are 12 of them. But you cannot see everything at once because there are so-called blind spots in our eyes. Moving on to colour. What colour are the circles you see here? That's right, different. Pink, green, yellow, sometimes pale blue. In fact, all the circles here are the same light pink colour. If we measure the colour values of the circles using the eyedropper in Photoshop, we will see the same numbers. That is, physically, the same wavelength affects your eyes from different parts of the screen. But at the same time, you see different colours, because the perception of a colour depends on the environment in which it is located. This illusion is called the Muncker-White's illusion. The next test will show you how your eye can make an error in assessing brightness. What colour are squares A and B on this board? You can see clearly that A is dark grey and B is light grey. But in fact, these squares are exactly the same. To see this, it is enough to connect them with one common plate. Another similar test, but this time in colour. What colour are these squares? I am absolutely sure that you perceive the bottom as yellow and the top as brown. In fact, these squares are the same colour. In order to see this, I will select one of them and move it to the other, and then move it back. As you can see, your eyes are often deceiving, so you can trust them only conditionally. And there is no such thing as true colour at all. Well, the last test. In my lectures, I call it a clean shot to the head. Now you will finally be convinced that your visual system is able to see something that does not exist at all. So, in front of us is a black and white photograph. In this test, I will show you 3 slides. The first one is black and white photography. It is already in front of you. The second slide will contain some kind of color abstraction. Those will be colored spots spread across the screen, and the third slide will be the same black and white photograph again. So the first and the last slide are the same black and white photograph. Between them are colorful nonsense, which we will be looking at for 10 seconds. In order for the test to be as clear as possible, you need to select a point on the image and look at it steadily. Let it be, for example, the right eye of the subject. For your convenience, I have marked this point in red. Ready? Now the color abstraction will appear and the countdown will begin. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Attention, I am switching back to black and white photography. What do you see? That's right. For a few seconds you observed a full color image, while looking at the black and white. This lasts a different amount of time for different people, usually from 1 to 6 seconds. This effect is related to the fact that a residual trace remains on the retina of our eye, which takes some time to reset to 0. Moreover, this trace has inverted colors. Instead of red, green. Instead of blue, yellow, etc. The longer the retina was exposed to that, the longer that trace persists. In our test, I showed you the inverted colors of the original color photo, which flipped on the retina to normal and was layered on the black and white image. As a result, for a few seconds you experienced a full-fledged color sensation, looking at a completely black and white image. To sum up, working with color, be it photography, painting or cinema, we cannot be guided by such criteria as true color, lifelike color, and so on. What we see is a kind of convention in our head. We are not dealing with wavelengths, but with sensations that arise under the influence of these waves or even without them at all. Accordingly, it makes sense for a color artist, photographer or colorist to work not with a spectrophotometer or a histogram, but with sensations. And in this case, we have completely different criteria for working with color, namely color variability, color harmony, and color expressiveness. There are several big topics behind these concepts that I may try to cover in the next videos. Hello everyone, Pavel Kosenko is speaking. Today, we will cover the second part of my 3-hour lecture, How to See Color. This time, we will focus on variability as the basis of color expressiveness. If you haven't watched the first part, I recommend starting with it. The link can be found in the comments section. This video is its continuation. So, in the previous video, I clearly demonstrated that your eyes are deceiving you. The relationship between what we see and how we perceive it is rather fragile. Hence, when working with color, we cannot be guided by such concepts as true color, lifelike color, etc. What does define a good color then? And what is a good color in general? Let's figure this out. The aesthetic perception of a person, be it visual, sound, tactile, or any other sensation, is based on the ability, and at the same time the need, to enjoy the nuances. Just like we savor fine food and fine wine, when we perceive color, our eye-brain systems savor subtle color details too. The more such details are in the image, and the more developed the ability of a particular person to perceive them, the more interesting and pleasant it is to look at. Color details are shades and midtones. They arise where the color changes. The smoother the color change, the more color details we can observe and savor them, getting aesthetic pleasure. The ability of a color to change, or one might say vary, according to certain characteristics within certain limits, is called color variability. In painting, the term value is used to describe this. The Dictionary of Pictorial Terms interprets it as follows: Color value, from Latin valere, to have power, to be worth, in the art of painting is a tonal nuance, a subtle difference of the same color in lightness. Value is achieved by the glaze technique. It allows you to achieve rich color relationships, the subtlest nuances and elusive color transitions. So artists have an expression in relation to such painting: to paint with values. In fact, the color can vary not only in lightness, but also in other components. Which one exactly depends on a coordinate system used to describe the color. For mixing paints and working with digital images, it is convenient to use the HSB system, where H is hue, color tone, S is saturation, B is brightness, lightness or brightness. In this coordinate system, color can vary in these three components. The first is variability in lightness. In this case, the color changes within certain limits only in its lightness component. Saturation and hue remain unchanged. When mixing paints, this variability is achieved by adding whitewash and soot. Good example is a shot of the famous photographer Rafal Milach. Notice how the color of the wall changes against the background of the main characters, smoothly and in a wide range from fairly light to almost black. In order to make color transitions invisible to the eye, a very large number of color gradations is needed. That is why this photograph can be confidently called multicolored, that is, rich in values, although to an inexperienced eye it may seem like bicolor. If you show this photo to an average person, then most often the first reaction is, "Who are these people? Why is a woman bald and a man is wearing heels?" This perception can be called objective. It is difficult for the viewer to perceive the image aesthetically since he does not understand what is depicted here. A sophisticated aesthetic viewer with a developed perception of color sees first of all a variable green wall in this photograph, and only then asks the question of what is depicted here. This perception can be called figurative. In order to learn to see color, it is important to perceive the world not only from the point of view of the objects of which it consists, but to attach importance to the color of these objects. And a good color is always a variable color. By the way, please note that the color in this photo is variable, also due to the lens vignetting, which, generally speaking, is considered a defect in optics, but for the color, it is the other way around, makes it more expressive. The second type of variability is saturation. In this case, the color changes within certain limits only in saturation. Lightness and shade remain unchanged. When mixing paints, this is achieved mainly by adding a gray paint similar in lightness to the most saturated paint. Take a still from the movie Zabriskie Point as an example. Notice how the orange color changes within the explosion, from bright to earthy gray. Tens of thousands of intermediate shades form the main richness of color nuances in this shot. They are the ones that are interesting for the demanding eye, although the less experienced viewer will be quite satisfied with the deliberately obvious contrast of the two primary colors, red, orange, and blue. There is also a variability in lightness in this frame, a blue sky, and just like in the previous example, lens vignetting only benefits the color. The third type of variability is hue. In this case, the color changes within certain limits only by the color tone. Lightness and saturation remain unchanged. When mixing paints, this is achieved by smoothly adding one paint to another. Let's look at a photograph by Sergei Maximishin. Despite the fact that he himself does not like being called an artist, emphasizing his specialization in photojournalism, I still think that Sergei is an artist with a capital letter, a photographer with an amazing vision of color. Look closely at how the turquoise and pink hues blend into each other behind the water pipes. Despite the fact that we see clear areas of each color, it is impossible to draw a clear border between them. This is achieved thanks to the ultimate smoothness of the gradient, that is, so many shades that the human eye ceases to see clear differences between adjacent ones. In real life, colours in photographs, paintings, and in movies rarely change in just one component. More often than not, they vary infinitely in all components at once, resulting in a complex, rich, and enjoyable colour composition. Consider another example, a photograph of Elios Erwitt. I have experimented many times and asked different people the same question. What do you like in this picture in terms of colour? Children and average untrained viewers most of the time point to the sail. It is this part of the photo that attracts their attention with its bright spots. Advanced photographers, colorists, and just aesthetes most often pay attention to the variable sky. Indeed, the sail is essentially bicolour, red and yellow. The variability within the corresponding stripes is not very high. The colour in them practically does not change. But in order to achieve such smooth colour transitions in the sky, tens of thousands of gradations were required. Let's see two more photos. Both are great, but they achieve colour expression in different ways. On the first, thanks to only two highly saturated contrasting colours, inside which there is almost no colour detail. The second, on the contrary, thanks to the huge number of halftones and smooth gradations, that is, colour variability. In fact, the photo on the left is bicolour. The photo on the right is almost infinitely multicoloured. The three types of variability that we have looked at can be represented by the HSB colour model. Let's recap. H is hue, S is saturation, and B is brightness. In English, the terms lightness and value are also used to denote the brightness component. They are used in slightly different ways from each other, but essentially similar colour models. From the perception point of view, it is not important how we call lightness and what model to use. It is important that we can represent all colours potentially perceived by a person in the form of this cylinder. Its central axis is the grayscale range from black to white points. The further the colour is from the central axis to the outer shell, the more saturated it is. And if you look at the cylinder from above, then we will see the familiar colour wheel. This model is purely theoretical, as it contains colours that do not exist. For example, this colour. It is absolutely black, the most intense yellow colour. This colour does not exist. Or this one. It is completely white, the most saturated blue colour. This colour also does not exist, neither in nature nor in our imagination. Generally speaking, all colours that are located on the top and bottom surface of the cylinder do not exist, except for the centres of these wheels, white and black points. All colours, when they are lightened or darkened, will sooner or later turn into either white or black, meaning that if we talk about the full human colour gamut as a model of perceived colours, then we will have to cut off some parts of it from this cylinder in a certain way. Here's what we get if we do it. To better understand this shape, we will cut a segment out of it in the same way as we cut a cake and look inside. It was once the same cylinder of theoretical colours. After we cut off colours that do not exist in human perception, we get a model of the full human colour gamut. The central axis of this model is the gradation of neutral shades from black, bottom, to white, top. The shades of black and white images lie on this axis. As the colour moves away from the central axis, it gets saturated, which reaches maximum purity in the range, that is, purity from third-party shades. The purest colours are located on the outer shell of the figure. If we look at it from above, we will see how the colour smoothly changes, and in 360 degrees it turns into itself again. Several useful observations can be made by looking at the full human colour gamut. Here are some of them. First observation. Each colour reaches its ultimate saturation, i.e. ultimate purity, at a different level of lightness. For example, the deepest blue is always dark. There is no light saturated blue colour. Such a colour will be light blue, weakly saturated. These colours are also called pastel colours. In the same way, for example, there is no dark bright yellow color. Such a color will inevitably be earthy, boggy. Second observation. If we make an extremely pure color lighter or darker, i.e. add white or black paint to it, then we will find ourselves in a zone of non-existent colors. In fact, in this case, we will move along the outer shell of our model. When darkening or lightening, the color will inevitably lose saturation, and in its range it will turn into absolutely unsaturated white, the central lower point on the axis of the figure, or black, the opposite upper point. Third observation. Saturation increase is a movement from the central axis of our model to its outer shell. What will happen with the color variability? That's right, it will inevitably decrease. Surprisingly, this also works in the opposite direction. Lowering the saturation increases the variability of the color, so it pollutes the image, meaning it adds new color gradations. Generally speaking, this is one of the basic principles of working with color. When speaking about it, artists often use the proverb, more mud, more fuse. Let's consider a specific example. In this photograph, red is at the limit of its saturation. Over the entire area, it is approximately the same and almost does not change. Details in red are almost indistinguishable. But as soon as the overall saturation of the image is lowered, the red becomes variable. In doing so, you most likely have a feeling that the overall color of the photo has become too faded. Do not jump into the conclusions. If you look at this option for at least 5 seconds and then switch back to a more saturated one, it becomes clear that the original option was really oversaturated. When you work with saturation and choose between the two options, I always recommend comparing an image in this way. Look at the less saturated option for a while, then suddenly switch to the more saturated one. Usually, you will immediately see whether you overdid it with saturation or, on the contrary, did not do it enough. On this note, let's wrap up the topic of color variability. In the next part of the video course, we will talk about color harmony. Hello everyone. Pavel Kosenko, the CEO of Dehancer, is here. This is the third part of my lecture, How to See Color. Today, we'll talk about color harmony. If you haven't watched the first 2 videos, I recommend starting with them. Links can be found in the comments. This video is the continuation of the lecture. All 3 parts were prepared by me and represent a complete theory of color. When talking about color harmony, most often the color wheel is in the spotlight. It is believed that harmonious colors are supposedly located on this circle in a special way. In fact, this is not true. The thing is, the color wheel is a flat model, and we already know that the color gamut is a 3-dimensional model. Meaning, all the variety of colors that a human is able to perceive cannot be placed on the color wheel, which means that it doesn't allow us to talk about the relationship between these colors. The misconceptions associated with the color wheel have arisen from the incorrect interpretation of the wording used by the artist, teacher, and writer Johannes Itten in his book, The Art of Color. The main misconception is as follows. It is generally accepted that if the colors located on the wheel balance each other out and add up to a neutral color, then they are harmonious. For example, these colors are supposedly harmonious, or these, or these, or these, and in general any colors that add up to a neutral gray. At the same time, it turns out that these colors are allegedly not harmonious, or these, or, say, these, because they don't balance each other out. In fact, everything is much easier. Let's consider a specific example, a photograph of Ilya Varlamov, which he kindly allowed me to use for the demonstration. This image contains a large number of bright saturated colors from different parts of the color wheel at the same time. I claim that these colors are disharmonious. Although if we reduce the photo to a size of 1 by 1 pixel and thereby average the color, then this pixel will turn out to be almost perfectly gray. This means that all the colors in this image balance each other out. That is, they are supposedly harmonious. In fact, This photo can hardly be considered as harmonious in color. It is full of all the shades of the rainbow. The colors are too saturated. There are too many of them, and they are not variable. I call such a coloristic solution color cacophony. Now let's process this snapshot in a certain way. It doesn't matter how I did it. We'll talk about it later. The important thing is that now the colors look much more harmonious. Although at first glance it seems that the color became too faded, inconspicuous, inexpressive. However, if you look at this one for 5 to 10 seconds and then suddenly switch to the original one, you will most likely agree that it is difficult to call it harmonious. It turns out that the theory of colors does not work very well. This means that we cannot use the color wheel model to talk about the harmony or disharmony of color ratios. What is the color harmony then? Let me share my own observations and thoughts on this topic. Let's do some visual experiments. For that, we will take any palette of various and at the same time bright, saturated colors. For example, this one, consisting of 12 colors. This palette can be more or a little less wide, it doesn't matter. For the experiment, 12 colors will be enough. I deliberately arranged them in the form of a rectangle so that you do not have associations with the color wheel. Looking at this palette, I claim that it is disharmonious. The colors are too saturated, there are too many of them, and they have nothing in common. If we were talking about music, such a palette could be compared with simultaneously and loudly extracted sounds of the entire octave of a piano from Do to C, including all white and all black keys. In both cases, we are dealing with cacophony. But if you take any two colors from our palette, then their combination will look quite harmonious. Besides, regardless of whether these are neighboring colors or not, whether they are warm or cold, contrasting or not, any two colors look harmonious, just like any two notes played on the piano are harmonious. Even such tense intervals as a minor second or tritones still sound quite harmonious because we clearly hear both sounds in them. Such a combination can hardly be called a cacophony. Harmonizing three notes is a little more complicated, but almost all triads will still sound quite harmonious. Although some triads might sound too tense. Harmonizing four notes is even more difficult. To do so, there are already certain rules for constructing seventh chords. It is curious that in music it is extremely rare to find chords consisting of more than 4 sounds of different pitches. And regarding 11th chord and 13th chord, which consist of 6 and 7 notes, in encyclopedias you can often find a following remark. These chords are never played simultaneously due to their dissonant character, or it's rare and not used due to their dissonance. Of course, this does not mean that musical compositions consist of a maximum of 4 notes, and pictures are painted with no more than 4 colors, but it is really difficult for a human to simultaneously perceive polyphony of more than 4 notes, and you can rarely find a painting using all colors at once. Usually, the color scheme of a canvas is based on some color accents and a few primary colors. The color variety is achieved not by incorporating all sorts of different colors, but by incorporating the large number of their gradations. Simply put, by the color variability. An interesting example is described in the book Color and Contrast, Technology and Creative Choice, written by a cameraman, Valentin Zeleznyakov. In June 1985, the State Hermitage Museum almost lost an amazing artwork by Rembrandt, Danae. Colorimetric analysis that was performed during the restoration works on the painting revealed that Rembrandt had only used a few colors, but their distribution on the canvas was astonishing in its intricacy. That is, All that chromatic and tonal richness that we can perceive when we look at this painting is the result of skillful combination of base colours that are by no means exotic. Another curious example is an anecdote shared by the remarkable contemporary artist Alexander Zavarin. As a student of Stroganov Academy of Art, I wasn't very keen on painting. To be honest, I wasn't very good at it either, so I shared my concerns with a friend who related a practical advice which he, in his turn, had heard from an old artist and a friend of his. The idea was to get rid of all the colours, leave only red ochre, yellow ochre, white and black, and use these 4 colours for everything: landscapes, portraits, still life, you name it. I did that and got my first A in a fine art class. This is how I really learned to see the colour. I introduced the other colours back, with time, but I still prefer moderation when it comes to palettes. Here is the very first student work of the artist, for which he received an A. Only 2 paints are used here, namely white and black. But what if we are dealing with an initially large number of colours? How to make it harmonious? It is important to understand that the key problem of the disharmony of a large number of saturated colours is the lack of coherence. Here, the only way to make their combination harmonious is to somehow bring the colours closer to each other. The easiest way to do so is to lower the saturation, as if you were adding grey paint to each colour. Let's do this for our experimental palette. In this case, I've reduced its saturation by about 30%. At first glance, the palette has become too faded and inexpressive, but we have done this experiment many times. In the same way as in all previous examples, wait 5 to 10 seconds and quickly switch to the original version. Now you can clearly see that the original colours are really dissonant with each other. Surprisingly enough, simply lowering the saturation makes the colours more harmonious. At its limits, it leads to a black and white image, which is always harmonious from the point of view of colour combinations. But this is not the only way of harmonization. Let's make it a little more complicated and try to harmonize the colours without decreasing their saturation too much. To do so, we won't use a grey paint to muddy up, meaning bring together the colours, but some other paint, for example, yellow. In my experience, adding warm tints to an image is beneficial to its perception. Many of you will agree that this option looks much more harmonious. At the same time, the palette is now perceived as quite naturally saturated. However, if we do this trick with a real image, then the harmonizing shade will be perceived as an even off shade, which we would be tempted to brush off the image. Practice shows that the viewer does not get such a feeling if the so-called benchmarking neutrals are obvious in an image with distorted but harmonized colors. That is, if the objects that we expect to see neutral look neutral, then usually we subconsciously believe in such a color scheme, no matter how realistic it is. Let's look at an example. Here is a photograph of Alfred Palmer, taken in 1942. This image is somewhat a deception. Let me explain why. This is an advertising photo taken as a part of the propaganda of the US military power against Nazi Germany. We see the workers of a military aircraft production plant. Pay attention to the manicure and makeup. Obviously, these were done specifically for the photo shoot and not before the start of the actual work shift. Deception? Of course, but without any doubt beneficial for the perception. Check out the professionally staged lighting. Deception? Of course. In reality, such a light would be directed to the face and interfere with work. Besides, this shot was taken on Kodachrome film, which greatly distorts and at the same time harmonizes the colors. Meaning, the very fact of shooting on film, and especially on such a film, is a deception in its purest form in terms of color rendering. Nevertheless, you and I believe this photo, for several reasons. The main ones are as follows. 1. Natural skin tones. This is really very important for our perception. No matter how distorted the colors are, but if skin tones are perceived as natural, we tend to believe any deception. 2. Presence of neutral hues on objects that we would expect to be neutral. In this case, these are A. Neutral black background. B. Relatively neutral grey metal. C. And most importantly, the neutral white collar of the blouse of one of the workers. In addition, it does not really matter what colour this blouse was. It could be blue, yellow, pink, or any other colour. For perception, it is only important what the viewer expects to see, and he expects to see it white. Therefore, the white blouse, together with the rest of the benchmarking neutrals, makes the viewer believe in the genuineness of the colour scheme of this photo, despite the fact that the colours are distorted here for the benefit of the viewer's perception. In order to see how important the role of the white blouse is, let's paint it in a colour that matches the overall warm tone of the photo, that is, yellow. In fact, the blouse could well have been that colour. But this is completely unimportant from the perception point of view, because this way the photo is perceived as if it has an off shade that you'd want to brush off. And as soon as the blouse becomes the expected neutral colour, the feeling of an off shade disappears, and we again find ourselves believing these deliberately distorted but harmonious colours. To sum up, colour scheme harmonization comes down to one of these two ways. 1. Lowering the saturation of all colours. 2. Bringing a large number of originally saturated colours closer together by muddying them up and/or mixing them with each other. Of course, it is possible and often necessary to use both methods at the same time. There are no other ways to harmonize colour. Since in both cases the original colour is distorted, benchmarking neutrals play an important role for the viewer's authentic perception. I believe that this is where colour theory can be concluded.